gastric tube so you could show a dose-response association. You measure the exact amount of human milk being put down that nasogastric tube. And we found that adolescents in the highest third of human milk intake had the lowest diastolic blood pressure 16 years later. Adolescents in the highest third of human milk intake had the lowest ratio of LDL, or bad cholesterol, compared to HDL, or good cholesterol, 16 years later. And does this matter? Well, if you could get the population to breastfeed, you would lower their cholesterol concentration by 10%. And this would reduce the incidence of cardiovascular disease by 25% and mortality by 13 to 14%. So huge public health benefits of early breastfeeding. Now I want you to notice two things here. These are the same beneficial effects shown in healthy infants born preterm or healthy infants born at term. But the other thing, these are the same beneficial effects or effects of overfeeding in animal models. And that's why I presented the animal data. So, to summarize so far, breastfeeding has long-term beneficial effects. Early overnutrition has harmful effects, first shown by this man McCance in the 1960s. But actually, this is something seen in every single animal species. In humans, in mice, mice, butterflies, and baboons, in all animals, early overnutrition and faster growth has adverse consequences for long-term health. The concept of grow now, pay later. And we put these two ideas together and suggested the reason the breastfed babies are doing so well wasn't anything magical of breast milk, but because they had slower growth and relative undernutrition in the breastfed compared to the formula-fed infant. The growth acceleration hypothesis, and by growth acceleration, I mean upward crossing in centiles for weight or length, as shown here. And so the question we've been trying to answer is, do differences in growth explain the benefits of breastfeeding? Well, we've known for many, many years that breastfed infants have a much slower rate of weight gain. This is data from Kate Dewey, 1993, showing you the weight for length in the formula-fed compared to the breastfed infant in the first 18 months of life. And it's not just weight. Length also differs. This is data from Alspach from 15,000 children from Bristol, showing you the length of bottle-fed and breastfed infants. They get to the same point, but they have a different pattern of growth, particularly in the first year of life. So the question is, why do breastfed infants grow more slowly? Well, the reason is that a formula-fed infant has up to 80% more protein intake than the breastfed infant in the first 6 months of life. And that's because human milk has a much lower energy protein content than formula. And in fact, humans, like all primates, differ from all other mammals. Relative to the body size, their milk has a much lower protein and energy content. And this produces a slow rate of weight gain, and that's important for the development of the brain. And we've known since 1869 that the protein content of formula, which is used, of cow's milk, which is used as the basis of formula, is twice that of human milk. And it's not surprising because cow's milk is best for cows. It's not designed for humans. Cows double their birth weight in 49 days. Humans take 149 days. And this is one of the main reasons we don't recommend cow's milk intake in the first year of life. There's too little energy, too little iron, too high protein. Since we published this hypothesis, there are now 5 systematic reviews showing that faster growth in infancy increases the later risk of developing obesity. It's been seen in term infants, preterm infants, or small for gestational age infants. It's been seen in every single country looked at, rich countries, poorer countries, weight gain and length gain. And it's been seen in this tiny little country here, Iceland. Iceland's important because the population there are 80 to 90% exclusively breastfed. And in other words, faster weight gain affects obesity risk in both the bottle-fed and the breastfed infant. The effect size is huge, ranging from a 20% increase to a 6-fold increase in obesity risk. The effect is greatest via visceral fat mass, which, as you know, is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And because your visceral fat mass is affected, there's an influence on insulin resistance. Faster weight gain affects insulin resistance as early as the first year of life. And there are now more than 50 studies that support the concept that faster weight gain in early life increases risk factors for cardiovascular disease. The effect is consistent. Not a single study hasn't shown this effect. There's a 2 to 3-fold increase in obesity risk, and as the environment takes over, the effect becomes smaller as you get older. There's no interaction by birth weight. By that I mean that faster early weight gain affects obesity risk independent of your size at birth, irrespective of size at birth. The problem is, and I come back to the main message, that many of these studies are observational. So are there confounding and environmental factors that influence both growth and future risk of obesity? Well, there are. There are at least 15 genes that make you grow quickly in obesity and in infancy and make you obese later in life. In fact, these obesity genes have probably developed not to make you obese, but to make you grow. And that has a clear evolutionary advantage. So what's the experimental evidence? And is there a causal link between being a nice chubby baby like this and being obese later in life? Well, we tried to answer this question in infants who are born small for gestation age. We used to think that if a baby was born small, you'd give the baby a lot of formula, a lot of food, and you'd improve their cognitive function. So we set up these trials in the 1990s. Babies born small for gestation age, weight below the 10th centile, randomized to standard or nutrient-enriched formula that contained 30% more protein, made the babies grow. There was a breastfed reference group, about 450 babies. The studies started in the 1990s. What we found is that babies who received the nutrient-enriched formula had better weight gain, as you'd expect, better head circumference, but there was no benefit for their cognitive function. In fact, the babies that had the nutrient-enriched formula had worse cognitive function at 9 months of age. What are the effects on fat mass and blood pressure? Well, babies who received the nutrient-enriched formula for 6 to 8 months, 6 to 8 years later, had higher diastolic blood pressure than those who received the standard formula. And this difference was explained by the rate of weight gain in infancy. The difference of 3 millimeters of mercury doesn't sound very much, but look what happens in a population basis. If you could reduce 2 millimeters of mercury in diastolic blood pressure, you'd reduce the prevalence of hypertension by 16%, the risk of coronary artery disease by 6%, the incidence of strokes by 15%. You would stop 100,000 cardiovascular events per year in the US alone. What are the effects on fat mass? We found exactly the same thing. Babies randomized to nutrient-enriched formula 6 to 8 years later had 30% more fat mass than those randomized to the standard formula. So STA infants given a nutrient-enriched formula showed no beneficial effects for later neurodevelopment or growth, but they had adverse effects on blood pressure and on fatness. Now, we were so surprised about this that we didn't publish it, we repeated it. We did a second randomized controlled trial, babies born below the 20th centile given standard versus enriched formula, 40% more protein. The formulas were given for 6 months, and we measured fat mass 5 to 7 years later using deuterium dilution, and found exactly the same thing. Babies who received the nutrient-enriched formula had higher fat mass than those receiving the standard formula. Because these are randomized controlled trials, we can say that faster infant weight gain increases obesity risk independent of genetic and environmental confounding factors. And this has changed how we look after babies with intrauterine growth retardation or small for their gestational age. Contrary to medical and public health opinion, rapid growth promotion in small but healthy full-term infants may prove to be inadvisable. The practice of looking after SGA infants has completely changed worldwide. The consensus statement of the management of the small for gestational age infants, published in 2007, said that calorie-dense feeding for SGA infants may not be appropriate. So, I've talked about small babies, I've talked about preterm infants, small for gestational age infants. Are these effects confined to low birth weight infants? Well, the answer is no, and that's based on the EU childhood obesity study. This was a large randomized controlled trial. The study was led by Bert Koletzko between October 2002 and July 2006, conducted in 5 countries, and it tested the idea that a high protein intake will increase the risk of developing obesity in formula-fed infants. As I mentioned, it's a large trial. 500 babies are given standard formula, 500 babies given a high-protein formula. The intervention was for 12 months, follow-up at 2 years, a breastfed reference group. Here are the two formulas, the low protein, the high protein. One was given for the first 6 months, one was given for the second 6 months. The important thing is that the formulas were isocalorific, they had the same energy. And this is the data. The top line is the high protein, the middle line is the low protein, the bottom line is the breastfed. The babies given the high protein formula had greater weight for length at 1 year of age and greater body mass index at 1 year of age, but they maintained this difference to 2 years of age, showing a programming effect. And I'll just remind you of this data I showed you in baboons. You made the baby baboons fat, the effect disappeared, and it came back. Human beings behave exactly the same. Those babies given the high protein formula at the age of 6 had more adiposity than babies given the low protein formula. And this has huge implications for health. It supports the idea that low protein intake in infancy reduces the risk of developing obesity, and it's been predicted that using a low nutrient intake in infancy will reduce your risk of obesity by about 13%. And now there are 5 randomized controlled trials that support the long-term benefits of slower growth in infancy. The studies I presented, the preterm infants, the SGA infants, 2 studies now in term infants. This bottom study is a randomized controlled trial in Chile, showing you that these effects are relevant to all populations. And if you look at the period of intervention, it ranges from the first few weeks to the first 12 months. Something is happening in the first year that has a permanent effect on your risk of developing obesity. And this may be one reason why, if you give babies solids before 4 months, you dramatically increase the risk of developing obesity later in life. You're making these babies grow too quickly. So, I've given you some of the evidence, discussed the benefits of human milk. I'm going to spend a few minutes on the mechanisms involved. Well, the concept of grow now, pay later is a well-known biological phenomenon seen across animal species. Growth has a benefit, but it also has a cost. As is common to biological systems, you can't have it both ways. You can either live fast or you can die young. You can't do both, and these bikers here know that. On the other hand, if you restrict growth and nutrition in a growing animal, you can reduce the incidence of tumors, kidney disease, vascular calcification, and chronic pneumonia. Mackay in 1947 showed that. And you can increase lifespan by 35%. More recently, Suzanne has shown exactly the same things. Slower growth in the animal model reduces the risk of obesity by 50% and increases longevity by 50%. In fact, the effects of slower growth on long-term health are seen across animal species, in mice, flies, worms, and even in yeast. And the mechanisms are probably involved in glucose IGF-1 systems, which are conserved in all of these animal species. The question we're trying to answer now, are human beings behaving the same as all other animals? And I think they are, and I'll show you why. We know that your aging or developmental factors have a major influence on cardiovascular disease. Men who have shorter telomeres, these are the end of the chromosomes, this is a marker of cellular aging, have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease independent of all other factors. And we've known for many, many years that faster growth in early life is associated with shorter telomere length, at least in animal models. We also know that growth affects developmental processes in humans. Faster early weight gain has been associated with early puberty in at least 6 cohort studies, summarized by Dave Dunga. And so you know that the age of menarche has been falling for the last 200 years in virtually all European countries. This may be due to benefits differences in lifespan, but it's also due in part to developmental factors. We know that rapid weight gain in infancy is associated with early puberty, and the mechanisms may involve obesity, insulin sensitivity, or an effect on aging. So, early nutrition affects future health. What are the signaling or coupling mechanisms that link something in the first few months with your heart attack or your obesity 50 years later? Well, I'm going to mention these very briefly. These are genetic, epigenetic factors, hormonal factors that affect appetite, and markers of aging such as telomere length and mitochondrial function. The most important hypotheses are genetic or hormonal, and the genetic hypothesis, there's only evidence from animal models that show that neonatal overfeeding is associated with hypermethylation of the insulin receptor promoter. Hypermethylation switches off the gene. So when these animals grow up, they have a lower receptor expression and lower and greater risk of insulin resistance. That's the only experimental data we have to show that epigenetic mechanisms are important in this. But I like the hypothesis that actually early infancy is a critical window for programming of neuroendocrine systems and the feedback loops that govern these systems. We know that the set points for hormone concentrations are actually set very early in infancy. So if you have a high IGF-1 in the first few weeks after birth, you're going to have a high IGF-1 level many, many years later. And there's strong evidence in humans that faster growth influences insulin resistance or insulin hormone concentrations, IGF-1 and leptin. Now I've been asked to spend a few minutes on IGF-1. We know from randomized studies that a high protein intake in infancy increases your risk of having high IGF-1 levels. The effect appears to be stronger in girls, and we know that a high cow's milk intake also increases IGF-1 levels. And so the hypothesis that a high protein intake influences obesity may be by the growth rate or may be by the IGF-1 mechanism. What's really interesting is that if you have a higher animal protein intake, you have higher IGF-1 levels. And small for gestational age infants show this pattern of catch-up growth, and this relies on your increasing your IGF-1 levels. They have normal levels at birth, but as they show catch-up growth, they have higher levels later in life. But in order to grow, they need to take more fuel. So there must be an effect on appetite, and this was shown in 1975. So the hypothesis is that faster growth influences your set point for appetite regulation many years later. Many, many studies have shown this in humans and in animals. And formula-fed infants are much less likely to regulate their appetite later in life. These are papers for the last few years. So if you give babies bottles, they're less likely to regulate their energy intake. What I think is absolutely remarkable is that if you replace this formula with human milk, you show exactly the same effect. In other words, children fed human milk from a bottle are 67% less likely to have a satiety response later in life. So you can overfeed babies by giving them formula, and you can overfeed babies by giving them a bottle. And the mechanisms do not involve leptin. They have been shown by Sue Zhan's group to occur in leptin-deficient mice. Now, this is a wonderful paper. There are at least 1,000 papers in the literature showing that programming is all to do with leptin. This one paper said it's nothing to do with leptin. Far more important is insulin, and we know that the levels of insulin in response to a feed completely differ in the breastfed and formula-fed infant as early as the first 6 days of life. So, giving you some of the evidence, discussed the long-term benefits of human milk, giving you some of the mechanisms, the underlying biology. For those of you who are still awake, you're doing very well. The last thing, does it really matter for health? Well, Ricardo Wowie, who's the professor of nutrition at the WHO, when he said this, he said, in the past, we've been working on the notion that bigger is better. That simply isn't true. We've been taking the norm for growth based on the formula-fed child. Our growth charts used to be based on the formula-fed infant, and this has greatly increased the risk of developing type 2 diabetes and obesity later in life. This is a cutting from an English newspaper saying nanny state is making kids fat. And the reason it's saying this is that we're using the wrong growth charts. And this is the basis for the WHO growth charts, which, as you know, are based on the slower growing breastfed infant between 2 weeks and 2 years of age. And I understand this morning that Kuwait has adopted these charts over the last year, which is, I think is good news. We've moved from science to changes in public health policy. The two most important bodies in the UK in terms of nutrition, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, said that current evidence suggests that a slower pattern of growth could potentially reduce the risk of developing later obesity. But I don't want you to go home with the idea that your obesity or your weight problem is entirely to do with your mother. I'm afraid it's a little bit more complicated than that, and you can't blame your mothers. And the UK government spent a lot of money and time, and they found all the causes of obesity. And this is what they found. These are the causes of obesity according to the Foresight map. Complicated issue. But what is interesting, that even within this mess, they recognized that the pattern of growth through early life contributes to the risk of excess weight gain. Most recently, the Institute of Medicine said we need to tackle excess weight gain in infancy to avoid problems later. It says new report on obesity, 5-6 years behind the rest of the world, but the Americans have got there in the end. They understand that we need to assess the rate of weight gain in infancy. We need to strongly support breastfeeding. And the most difficult message of all, if you remember one thing from this lecture, parents need to understand that bigger is not always better. And I would like to put grandparents need to understand that bigger is not always better. There are now trials going on in the States, at least 5 trials, which are trying to reduce the rate of weight gain in infancy. They're teaching mums to look at feeding cues to discriminate between hunger, when the baby cries because it's hungry, or when the baby is crying for another reason. Don't just put a bottle or a breast in the baby's mouth. Introduce solids later on. All of these studies have worked. They've reduced the rate of weight gain in infancy, in both the breastfed and the formula-fed infant, not just the formula-fed. And this has had an influence on obesity. This is one randomized controlled trial from Australia where infants were randomized to a control arm or home-based intervention. This home-based intervention was based on appropriate feeding, breastfeeding, delayed introduction of weaning foods, and appropriate nutrition to the age of 2 years. When they followed these babies up, there was a 0.3 SD difference between the two randomized groups. So early intervention does work. So, to summarize, I think I should be well in time. I hope I've convinced you that the answer to the question, does infant nutrition influence future obesity, is clearly yes. The evidence ranges from the earliest work by this man, Professor McCance, who showed that differences in nutrient intake prior to weaning produce massive effects in the size of the adult rat, the undernourished rat versus the well-nourished rat. You don't need to be a statistician. You can see these differences in the animals. There's not a mild, small effect. The same thing is likely to be happening in humans and could explain the differences in outcomes between babies who are given breast milk versus those who are given formula. Differences in early growth are likely to explain differences in outcome. Nick Stetler from the States has estimated that the effect size is huge. He's estimated in countries such as America or UK, where the obesity is high, your infant weight gain explains 1/3 of your risk of developing later obesity. For those of you who believe in a genetic cause of obesity, I'm afraid I don't, and this is the reason why. In 2012, there were 32 known markers for obesity, genetic markers, all of them together. If I knew every single one of your markers for genes, all 32 genes, I could explain 1.5% of the variance in phenotypical variance in body mass index. Genes are going to be important. They're going to be important for the individual, but when it comes to the population, they're going to have a very small effect. I think how you look after babies in terms of nutrition depends whether they're nutritionally vulnerable or they're perfectly healthy. In the vulnerable preterm infant, you have to balance the benefits for high nutrition, for short-term health, cognitive function, and bone health against the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. They show exactly the same phenomena. The phenomena are seen in all animals, in all types of humans, breastfed infants, preterm infants. Those who grew fast have increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But in the preterm infant, you ignore this side of the equation. You only focus on the short term. And the same may apply to babies that grow up in this type of incredibly impoverished environment. This study from Brazil showed that babies who were born small for gestational age, who had fastest weight gain, had fewer hospital admissions. So there's no doubt where there's malnutrition and infectious diseases, faster weight gain may have benefits. But it's important to remember that how we feed our babies is being incredibly shaped by famine. It's not how the optimal way of feeding babies. We are more concerned about undernutrition compared to older nutrition. But I argue that is yesterday's battle, not today's battle in most countries. And we've now moved from deficiency to excess. So in the West, we're overfeeding our babies with long-term consequences for their health. And the American Heart Association summarizes this up beautifully: don't supersize your babies. 3 very quick take-home messages. Breastfeeding is a public health intervention, not just a lifestyle choice of how to feed your babies. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has now said exactly just that. It's now well accepted that breastfeeding reduces your risk of developing later obesity. The 4 most important bodies have said this: Dutch Institute of Nutrition and Health, the WHO, UK Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, and US Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. They all accept that breastfeeding reduces your risk of developing obesity. Faster infant weight gain increases long-term risk of developing obesity as well. And the 3rd and final message is that programming gives you susceptibility, not certainty. And I'll illustrate this by the original slide here. Obesity results from energy intake being greater than energy expenditure. Your genes and environment, and I've given you the evidence of developmental factors, all influence energy balance. But it's important to remember, you do not become obese unless you have a positive energy balance, the environment. If you are a poor rickshaw driver in India, it doesn't matter what your genes are, it doesn't matter whether you're breastfed or bottle-fed, the environment is the most important factor, and you can still do something about it. So when it comes to obesity, I'm afraid it's usually to do with too much of this, and one of my favorite directors summarized this up beautifully. He said, when it comes to obesity, my doctor told me to stop having intimate dinners for 4 unless there were 3 other people involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation and a lot of lessons to be learned, especially for Kuwait. Now I will open the floor for questions. If anybody has any question with regard to the previous 2 presentations. Professor James, would you like to come up here with the professor so that we can all answer if there are any questions or queries? You've either shocked them or, I don't know.
Shall we go back down?
I would like to ask a question to Dr. James. Are you aware of any interventions to promote physical activity at a national or international level that may have an impact on the global obesity epidemic?
There are huge efforts going on now. There's an integrated physical activity group that actually has reformed in the last 5-6 years. There have been a series of interventions, for example in Finland, where you can show that actually it's extremely effective on a semi-national basis for improving the problem of the risk of diabetes. It then has a small effect on reducing the prevalence of obesity in the population, but that includes a dietary intervention. There is no doubt that physical activity is of extreme importance in increasing insulin sensitivity, and therefore there's evidence that it helps cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But to my knowledge, despite the Agito Mundo work that started in Sao Paulo and Brazil, and then went across the world, I don't know of any evidence at the moment that a national policy for physical activity has led to a reduction in obesity. That does not mean that it's not important, but the evidence is that if you get everybody going to the gym, or some people going to the gym, that does not predict the fact that the gym people will be less obese. In Australia, a beautiful study showed that the physically very fit people were quite often the fattest, because after they'd been to the gym, they sat in front of the television, and it was the amount of sitting that people did that was more important. So the physical activity story is complicated, and the difficulty for Kuwait is that everybody's been brainwashed to use cars. And if you look at the UK, for example, there's a huge gradient across the country. And some of that is socio-economic and affects the food intake. But the other thing is, for example, in London, people are doing far more walking because of public transport than in the north, where the public transport's not as good.
Yeah, I can certainly comment in pediatrics. There have been lots and lots of systematic reviews to look at what factors you can treat, what interventions work in the treatment of pediatric obesity. And there's lots of papers that show that physical activity alone does not reduce your obesity. You need a multi-component intervention, of which physical activity is one important component, but you need behavioral change, diet, physical activity, as well as psychological change. You need a component thing.
I have a question here, please, for Dr. Singhal. Please, do you have any data on the rate of exclusive breastfeeding in the UK? Yeah,
I know that data very well. It's incredibly poor. At 1 week of age, only 45% of babies are exclusively breastfed. 1 week. And that's one of the things that we're trying to change, but not very successfully at the moment.
Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Dr. Iman, I'm a pediatric endocrinologist. I just have more of comment and inquiry about with Prof. James regarding the study which was published in Kuwait, the Lancet, the recent one. I didn't have a chance to read it. I just want to comment on when they mention about the stent growth less than 6, because this is not actually what the observation or we are seeing with our patients with obese is mainly tall at less than 6 and stunt after because of the early puberty. So I'll be more interested to know about the details about this study.
I'd better look at the data, but this is in the Lancet, many people do not know that there is a huge supplement on Arab health in the Lancet in the last few weeks, since January. And you can get a copy of that supplement. And it's produced not by Europeans or Americans, but by Middle East physicians using the national data. And that information is, I think it's based on step analyses and so on. And you understand the step things? These are measured, systematically randomized people, in theory anyway, from different countries. So this is meant to be very good data. And so if you're saying that observational studies suggest this, you've got to be very careful, because you have to distinguish between the nationals and, of course, the total population. And I'm pretty sure the STEPS program is meant to be the total population, Dr. Noah.
Yes, the ones you're referring to the Iman project, right? The stepwise.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
So I mean, and do many of these studies, and it was earlier in the program, you had some studies on what the problem of weight and height is in adults, for example. Most of those come from asking people what their height and weight is. That gives hopeless evidence. You need good measurements, and I've only presented good measurements.
I think part of the confusion is the difference between public population health and the individual health. I think that's where the discrepancy in your statement. There's no doubt that most obese people are tall and obese, and that's, endocrinologists use that as a way of saying there's an underlying endocrine cause. If you're short and obese, they may have an endocrine problem. But the Lancet data really deals with across the population. So in that situation, the two things won't match up. You see the difference?
But in the children, you can also have shorter, fatter children. Yeah. And that's very common, for example, in Latin America and in Asia now. You have short, fat children. And it's beginning, I don't know, I think that this is probably happening in the Middle East too.
Yeah.
Hi. I would just like first to thank both of you for the fabulous lecture. I just actually have a comment, not a question. My name is Ali Al-Saraf. I'm a clinical dietitian from Mubarak Al-Kabir Hospital. So I'm actually participating in a poster with the same idea that we are talking about. Not that we only have like one factor affecting or causing obesity, it's rather a multifactorial thing. So actually one of the things, speaking back about the physical activity in Kuwait, the government here invested in something they called Mubaratna, an initiative that was aimed to have more soccer fields across Kuwait, or football, and as they call it in other countries. So it's the most popular game. So they actually invested in 61 fields, soccer fields, and the newspaper, the minister said that actually 84,000 person benefited from this initiative in just a short time. So there are some things that are being done in Kuwait, but still we are behind in some other things. Like one of the things that we like here in Kuwait is pedestrian lanes. That thing actually affects the mobility of people and let them or force them to use the cars as it's more safe to do so. So that's my only comment for that, and just thank you for both. Thank you for both of you. Thank you.
Could I comment on that? Because I've been privileged to be discussing with academics the problem of the public health and the nutrition problems, both in children and adults in the Middle East for the last 40 years. When I was doing early work on malnutrition, you had wonderful academic centers in Beirut that dealt with malnutrition in the Middle East. Iran had terrible problems of malnutrition when I was a young physician. So you've had huge problems of malnutrition, but what's happened is that you had public health policies originally for malnutrition, and over the last 30 years you've gone for easy solutions which you think are based on helping individuals to change, but the cars and the public transport and computers have come in, and it makes it very difficult to be physically active. And now you see in Kuwait, I don't know if you realize that we must do, 95% of your food is imported. We heard this morning that food subsidies are being given. And I've been told this morning that you even subsidize infant formula, which is incredible. You also, I think, subsidize sugar. You also subsidize oil. And from my analyses of the industrial importation of oils in Kuwait, the second highest import is palm oil, which is a killer. Please understand, it's full of saturated fat, and your heart disease rates are incredible and going up. So actually, you know, physical activity interventions, very valuable, but they're not as valuable as government policy changes. And the problem with ministers and officials in government is they're going to need to understand that the leaders of the world have agreed 2 years ago to change policy, not just tell everybody what to do, but to change policy. And we just are starting. I'm spending all my time now trying to change policies in the Middle East with the help of the regional World Health Regional Director. I work from Cairo. I've been to Dubai, Oman, and Cairo this year before I've come here. It's a huge problem because governments will not realize they have to do something, and it has to be big.
Well, welcome back, everybody. It's the last session before lunch, and it's my great pleasure to co-chair this session. And the first speaker is Dr. Ahmad Al-Sari, who's an assistant professor of human genetics at the Faculty of Medicine in Kuwait University. He has numerous qualifications, and he's worked in human genetics at Leeds. He's got a